Have you ever wondered why humanity has been obsessed with the end of the world for thousands of years? From ancient civilizations to modern blockbuster movies, we can't seem to stop imagining our own destruction. But here's what's fascinating. The pattern of how we imagine the end reveals something profound about human psychology, our deepest fears, and our desperate need for meaning in an uncertain world. Over the next 30 minutes, we're going to explore why apocalyptic narratives have such a powerful grip on the human mind, what they tell us about ourselves, and why understanding this psychological pattern might be one of the most important insights you gain this year. Because whether you realize it or not, apocalyptic thinking shapes politics, influences social movements, affects mental health, and impacts how millions of people make decisions every single day. Let's start with a question that might make you uncomfortable. Why do so many people seem almost excited about the world ending? If you spend any time on social media or in certain communities, you'll notice something strange. There's an energy, almost an anticipation, when people discuss catastrophic scenarios. This isn't sadism or mental illness. It's actually a deeply rooted psychological mechanism that's been part of human cognition for millennia. Understanding this mechanism is crucial because it affects not just religious communities, but environmental movements, political ideologies, and even how we process news about technology or pandemics. The human brain has evolved to be a pattern recognition machine. We survived as a species because our ancestors could identify threats, predict dangers, and prepare for worst-case scenarios. But here's where it gets interesting. Our brains are so good at this that they sometimes create patterns where none exist. When life feels chaotic or meaningless, apocalyptic narratives provide something incredibly valuable: a clear storyline with a beginning, middle, and end. They transform random suffering into purposeful tribulation. They turn senseless tragedy into meaningful signs. And perhaps most importantly, they give believers a sense of being part of something larger than themselves, a cosmic drama where they play a significant role. Think about the structure of apocalyptic narratives across cultures and throughout history. Whether we're looking at ancient Zoroastrian texts, biblical revelations, Norse Ragnarok, Hindu Kali Yuga, or modern science fiction, they all share remarkably similar elements. There's always a build-up of catastrophes, a battle between good and evil, the destruction of the corrupt old world, and the birth of a purified new reality. This isn't coincidence. This structure mirrors something fundamental about how humans process change, loss, and transformation. Let's dive deeper into what psychologists call the apocalyptic archetype. Carl Jung, the famous psychoanalyst, argued that apocalyptic imagery emerges from the collective unconscious, a shared reservoir of human experience and symbolism. According to Jung, end times narratives represent psychological death and rebirth. They're not primarily about physical destruction, but about the death of old identities, outdated worldviews, and corrupt systems. The apocalypse, in this view, is actually a story about transformation. It's the psyche's way of processing massive change and preparing for radical renewal. This explains why apocalyptic beliefs surge during periods of social upheaval. When empires fall, when plagues spread, when economic systems collapse, when technology disrupts traditional ways of life, people instinctively reach for apocalyptic frameworks to make sense of the chaos. The apocalyptic narrative says, yes, everything is falling apart, but this isn't random. This is necessary. This destruction serves a purpose, and on the other side of this suffering, something better will emerge. Now, let's examine what psychologists call cognitive dissonance and how it relates to apocalyptic belief. Cognitive dissonance is the mental discomfort we experience when our beliefs conflict with reality. Here's where apocalyptic movements demonstrate something fascinating about human psychology. They're incredibly resilient to disconfirmation. When predicted dates for the end times come and go without incident, you might expect believers to abandon their convictions. But research shows something counterintuitive happens instead. Many believers become more committed, not less. The classic study of this phenomenon comes from Leon Festinger's book, When Prophecy Fails, which examined a UFO cult that predicted the world would end on a specific date. When that date passed uneventfully, instead of disbanding, the group intensified their missionary efforts. Why? Because they reinterpreted the non-event as evidence that their faith had actually saved the world. This psychological mechanism appears repeatedly throughout history. The predicted date gets recalculated, the interpretation gets refined, but the core belief structure remains intact. Understanding this helps explain why apocalyptic movements can persist for centuries, despite repeated failed predictions. Let's talk about the social psychology of in-groups and out-groups, because this is crucial to understanding apocalyptic appeal. Apocalyptic narratives almost always divide humanity into two categories: the saved and the damned, the righteous and the wicked, those who see the truth and those who remain blind. This binary thinking serves powerful psychological functions. It provides moral clarity in a morally ambiguous world. It offers a clear identity. You know who you are because you know who you're not. And perhaps most seductively, it provides a form of cosmic justice. The apocalypse becomes the great equalizer, where current power structures get inverted, where the humble are exalted and the mighty are brought low. This promise of reversal is psychologically intoxicating, especially for marginalized communities. Throughout history, apocalyptic movements have flourished among oppressed populations. Early Christians under Roman persecution, medieval peasants suffering under feudalism, enslaved peoples enduring brutality, colonized populations facing cultural destruction. The apocalyptic narrative tells them, your suffering isn't permanent. Your oppressors will face judgment, justice will prevail, and you will be vindicated. This isn't just religious comfort, it's a psychological survival mechanism that helps people endure unbearable circumstances by reframing them within a larger narrative of ultimate meaning and justice. But here's where we need to acknowledge something important. Apocalyptic thinking isn't confined to religious contexts. Secular apocalypticism is alive and well in modern society. Climate change narratives sometimes take on apocalyptic tones. Political movements on both left and right frame their opponents as existential threats that will destroy civilization. Technological pessimists predict AI will end humanity. Economic doomers stockpile for societal collapse. The structure remains the same. We're approaching a cataclysmic breaking point. Current systems are corrupt and doomed. Catastrophe is imminent, and only those who prepare or believe correctly will survive into the new world. Let's examine what neuroscience tells us about why apocalyptic imagery is so vivid and memorable. Brain imaging studies show that emotionally charged scenarios, especially those involving threat and survival, activate the amygdala, the brain's fear center, much more intensely than neutral information. This creates stronger neural pathways and more durable memories. Apocalyptic visions, with their dramatic imagery of destruction, cosmic battles, and supernatural phenomena, are designed, whether intentionally or evolutionarily, to be unforgettable. They hijack our threat detection systems and create lasting impressions that neutral information simply cannot match. This explains why apocalyptic content goes viral on social media. Algorithms favor engagement, and nothing engages quite like fear mixed with significance. A post saying gradual improvements are happening slowly gets ignored. A post declaring we're on the brink of collapse gets shared thousands of times. Our brains are wired to prioritize threat information, and apocalyptic narratives deliver threat information in its most concentrated, dramatic form. Now, let's talk about temporal psychology, our relationship with time, and how apocalyptic belief alters it. Normally, humans struggle with long-term thinking. We discount future rewards. We procrastinate. We struggle to connect our present actions with distant consequences. But apocalyptic belief does something remarkable. It collapses the future into the present. When the end is near, when judgment is imminent, when the cosmic clock is running out, suddenly the distant future becomes urgently relevant. Time becomes precious, decisions become momentous, and life becomes dramatically meaningful. This temporal compression can be psychologically energizing. It combats existential ennui and the sense that nothing matters. It transforms mundane existence into a high-stakes drama. Every choice becomes weighted with cosmic significance. Every moment becomes potentially your last chance to choose correctly. This intensity can be addictive. Normal life, with its ambiguity and gradual unfolding, can feel unbearably flat compared to the heightened reality of apocalyptic consciousness. Let's explore the relationship between apocalyptic belief and what psychologists call terror management theory. This theory, backed by decades of research, suggests that humans have a unique and potentially devastating awareness. We know we're going to die. This knowledge creates existential anxiety that we must constantly manage. We manage it through cultural worldviews that provide meaning, through self-esteem that gives us a sense of value, and through beliefs in symbolic or literal immortality. Apocalyptic narratives are brilliant terror management systems. They take the individual's inevitable death and embed it within a cosmic drama where death itself is transformed. Death isn't random annihilation, but a transition point. It's not the end of your story, but a crucial chapter in a larger narrative. And for believers, it potentially leads not to oblivion, but to vindication, resurrection, or eternal reward. The apocalypse collectivizes death, making it not a personal tragedy, but a universal transformation. This is psychologically powerful because it addresses our deepest fear by recontextualizing it within a framework of ultimate meaning. Let's discuss the paradox of apocalyptic hope. This might sound contradictory. How can a narrative of destruction be hopeful? But this is actually one of the most psychologically sophisticated aspects of apocalyptic belief. The apocalypse represents what theorists call creative destruction. Yes, the corrupt world must be destroyed, but this destruction is necessary for renewal. The old must die so the new can be born. This narrative structure mirrors natural cycles, death and rebirth, winter and spring, caterpillar and butterfly. For people living in circumstances that feel hopeless, where systemic problems seem insurmountable and incremental change feels impossible, the apocalyptic narrative offers something radical, the promise that the entire system can be reset. You don't have to figure out how to reform corruption from within. You don't have to navigate impossible contradictions. The slate will be wiped clean, and something fundamentally new will emerge. This is apocalyptic hope. Hope so radical, it requires total destruction as its prerequisite. Now, let's examine the psychological function of the elaborate imagery and symbolism common in apocalyptic visions. Whether we're looking at multi-headed beasts, cosmic battles, bowls and trumpets, or any other symbolic elements, these aren't arbitrary details. They serve specific psychological purposes. First, symbolic complexity creates interpretive flexibility. Concrete predictions can be falsified, but sufficiently complex symbols can be endlessly reinterpreted to fit changing circumstances. Second, the need for interpretation creates dependency on authorities who can decode the symbols, strengthening community bonds and hierarchies. Third, the vivid surreal imagery makes the narrative more memorable and emotionally impactful than plain statements would be. Let's talk about what social psychologists call social proof and how it amplifies apocalyptic movements. Humans are deeply influenced by what others believe, especially during uncertainty. When we're unsure about reality, we look to others for guidance. Apocalyptic movements create self-reinforcing belief systems where the conviction of fellow believers serves as evidence of truth. The more people believe, the more credible it seems. The more credible it seems, the more people believe. This creates powerful momentum that can sweep up individuals who might otherwise be skeptical. Social media has supercharged this effect. You can now find communities of believers for even the most niche apocalyptic scenarios. These echo chambers provide constant social proof, protecting beliefs from contrary evidence and creating the impression that everyone sees what you see. This isn't stupidity, it's how human cognition works. We're social creatures who evolved to trust our tribe's collective judgment, and digital technology has exploited this ancient mechanism in new ways. Let's explore the relationship between control and apocalyptic belief. Research in psychology consistently shows that humans need to feel some sense of control over their circumstances. When control is threatened, we experience anxiety and seek to restore it. Here's the paradox. Apocalyptic narratives describe scenarios of ultimate loss of control, massive forces beyond human influence, yet they paradoxically restore a sense of control. First, by knowledge. You may not control the events, but you understand them. You're not blind, you see what's coming. This epistemic control reduces anxiety even when practical control is absent. Second, apocalyptic frameworks often include preparatory actions, store supplies, strengthen faith, spread warnings, join the community. These actions create a sense of agency. You can't stop the apocalypse, but you can prepare for it, and that preparation restores a measure of control. Third, and perhaps most importantly, apocalyptic beliefs give you control over meaning. Events aren't random chaos, they're fulfilling a plan, and you understand that plan. This interpretive control may be the most powerful psychological benefit of all. Now let's examine what happens psychologically when apocalyptic beliefs fail to materialize. We touched on cognitive dissonance earlier, but let's go deeper. The psychological aftermath of failed apocalyptic predictions reveals fascinating aspects of human belief maintenance. Some individuals do leave the movement, experiencing what psychologists call deconversion, which can be traumatic. The entire framework through which they understood reality collapses, leaving them with grief, anger, shame, and the difficult work of reconstructing a worldview. But many believers don't leave. Instead, they engage in sophisticated cognitive reframing. The prediction wasn't wrong, just mistimed. The interpretation needed refinement. The apocalypse happened spiritually rather than physically. The faithful actually prevented the catastrophe through their belief. Or, interestingly, the suffering of having believed incorrectly becomes proof of devotion, a trial that tests true believers and separates them from fair-weather followers. These aren't irrational responses. They're the brain's attempts to preserve an identity and worldview that has become central to the believer's sense of self. Let's talk about childhood development and apocalyptic belief. Children raised within apocalyptic frameworks face unique psychological challenges. Research shows that growing up with the constant expectation of imminent world-ending events can create persistent anxiety, difficulty with future planning, and complex relationships with hope and fear. Some children develop resilience and eventually integrate or separate from these beliefs in healthy ways. Others carry the psychological imprint throughout their lives, even if they intellectually reject the beliefs later. What's particularly interesting is how childhood exposure to apocalyptic narratives shapes neural pathways and emotional responses. The developing brain is extraordinarily sensitive to repeated messages about threat and safety. Children who grow up hearing that the world is ending soon, that disaster is imminent, that they must always be spiritually prepared, can develop hypervigilant nervous systems that continue operating in threat mode even when they consciously no longer believe the narrative. Let's explore the gender dynamics of apocalyptic movements, because this reveals important psychological patterns. Historically, apocalyptic movements have offered complex relationships with gender and power. On one hand, many apocalyptic traditions have been deeply patriarchal, featuring masculine warrior imagery and male savior figures. On the other hand, apocalyptic contexts have sometimes allowed women and marginalized gender expressions to claim authority they couldn't access in mainstream society. Prophetesses, female visionaries, and gender non-conforming spiritual leaders have found space in apocalyptic movements precisely because the end times represent a disruption of normal hierarchies. Psychologically, this makes sense. If the current order is corrupt and doomed, then current rules about who can have authority are also invalidated. The apocalypse creates a liminal space, a threshold moment where normal social structures are suspended and new arrangements become possible. For people excluded from power in normal times, the apocalypse represents opportunity. Now let's discuss the economic psychology of apocalyptic belief. There's a material dimension to apocalyptic movements that deserves attention. Apocalyptic belief can profoundly affect economic behavior. Why save for retirement if the world is ending? Why pursue education or career advancement? Why invest in long-term projects? Some apocalyptic movements have encouraged radical divestment from worldly concerns, with believers selling possessions, abandoning careers, and focusing exclusively on spiritual preparation. Conversely, there's a robust marketplace that caters to apocalyptic anxiety, survival gear, bunkers, prepping supplies, gold investments marketed as disaster hedges, and countless books and media predicting imminent collapse. Understanding the economic incentives behind apocalyptic messaging helps explain why these narratives persist and proliferate. Fear sells, and apocalyptic fear sells especially well because it frames purchases not as consumer choices, but as survival necessities. Let's examine the relationship between apocalyptic belief and political radicalization. This is where apocalyptic psychology becomes genuinely dangerous. When political opponents are framed not as people with different ideas, but cosmic forces of evil that must be destroyed before they destroy everything, violence becomes not just justified, but necessary. The apocalyptic framework removes moral constraints because normal morality applies to normal times, and these aren't normal times. These are the end times, when extraordinary measures are required. History is filled with examples of apocalyptic belief fueling violence, from medieval millenarian uprisings to modern terrorist movements to politically motivated attacks by individuals convinced they're fighting in a cosmic war. The psychological mechanism is chillingly clear. When you genuinely believe that allowing evil to triumph will result in eternal consequences, when you believe you're fighting not a political battle, but a spiritual war for the fate of humanity, when you believe time is running out and desperate action is needed, violence becomes not a transgression, but a duty. This is why understanding apocalyptic psychology matters so much in our current moment. We're living through an era of intense polarization, environmental crisis, technological disruption, and geopolitical instability. These are exactly the conditions under which apocalyptic thinking flourishes, and we're seeing it flourish across the political spectrum. Recognizing the psychological patterns, the emotional appeals, and the logical structures of apocalyptic narratives is crucial for maintaining our individual and collective mental health and for preventing the violence that apocalyptic thinking can justify. Let's talk about therapeutic approaches to apocalyptic anxiety. For mental health professionals, clients experiencing distress related to apocalyptic beliefs present unique challenges. You can't simply dismiss beliefs that may be central to someone's identity and community. Effective therapy involves understanding the psychological needs these beliefs fulfill, the need for meaning, for community, for cosmic justice, for control in an uncertain world. Then, the therapeutic work involves finding healthier ways to meet those needs. Cognitive behavioral approaches can help clients examine the evidence for apocalyptic claims, identify cognitive distortions, and develop more balanced perspectives. Mindfulness-based interventions can help clients stay grounded in present reality rather than catastrophic future scenarios. Trauma-informed care is often necessary because apocalyptic anxiety frequently has roots in earlier trauma that made the world feel unsafe. And community-based interventions can help individuals find belonging and purpose outside apocalyptic frameworks. Now let's discuss what evolutionary psychology suggests about apocalyptic narratives. From an evolutionary perspective, the human capacity for apocalyptic thinking may have developed because groups with strong shared narratives about cosmic meaning and ultimate purpose had survival advantages. They cooperated more effectively, made greater sacrifices for the collective, and maintained social cohesion even under extreme stress. The content of the narrative mattered less than its ability to bind the group together and motivate coordinated action. This evolutionary heritage means apocalyptic thinking isn't a bug in human cognition, it's a feature. It's part of how our brains are built. This doesn't mean we should embrace apocalyptic thinking, but it does mean we need to understand it as a persistent aspect of human psychology that will continue appearing in new forms regardless of how many previous apocalyptic predictions fail. The solution isn't to try eliminating apocalyptic thinking entirely, which is probably impossible, but to channel it in less harmful directions and to cultivate awareness of when we're falling into apocalyptic patterns. Let's explore the concept of apocalyptic exhaustion. Many people who have lived with sustained apocalyptic anxiety eventually reach a breaking point. They're exhausted from living in constant crisis mode, from the emotional roller coaster of heightened meaning followed by anticlimactic non-events, from the cognitive burden of maintaining increasingly elaborate explanatory frameworks. This exhaustion can lead to either deep conversion or to a kind of apocalyptic numbness, where they still nominally but can no longer sustain emotional intensity. This exhaustion is actually a protective mechanism. The human nervous system isn't designed to maintain peak alertness indefinitely. Eventually, even the most committed believer experiences habituation, where the apocalyptic warnings lose their emotional impact. This is why apocalyptic movements must constantly refresh their messaging, finding new signs, new dates, new interpretations to reignite the fading urgency. Let's talk about healthy versus unhealthy apocalyptic thinking. Not all engagement with end times narratives is psychologically damaging. Many people find meaning, community, and ethical motivation in apocalyptic traditions without experiencing significant distress or dysfunction. The difference seems to lie in flexibility, balance, and integration. Healthy engagement allows for uncertainty, doesn't demand absolute conviction, maintains connections with people who believe differently, continues participation in normal life activities, and doesn't create crippling anxiety. Unhealthy apocalyptic thinking, by contrast, is rigid, demands absolute certainty, creates insular communities that cut off outside contact, interferes with practical life functioning, and generates severe anxiety or depression. It treats doubt as betrayal, conflicting evidence as persecution, and moderate voices as dangerous compromises. Understanding this distinction helps us support people in processing apocalyptic narratives in ways that provide meaning without destroying well-being. Now let's examine the role of authority figures in apocalyptic movements. Psychologically, apocalyptic contexts create space for charismatic leaders to wield enormous influence. The complexity of apocalyptic interpretation, the anxiety it generates, and the high stakes involved make followers desperate for authoritative guidance. Leaders who claim special knowledge, divine communication, or unique interpretive ability can command extraordinary loyalty and obedience. This dynamic creates vulnerability to exploitation. History is replete with apocalyptic leaders who leverage their followers' psychological dependence for personal, financial, or sexual gain. Understanding this pattern is crucial for recognizing and resisting manipulation within apocalyptic contexts. Let's discuss the relationship between apocalyptic belief and creativity.
Interestingly, apocalyptic frameworks have generated some of humanity's most powerful art, literature, music, and film. The apocalyptic imagination, with its vivid imagery and ultimate stakes, provides rich material for creative expression. From Hieronymus Bosch's paintings to Dante's Inferno to modern science fiction, apocalyptic themes have inspired profound artistic achievement. Psychologically, this makes sense. Creativity often involves breaking down existing structures and imagining radically new possibilities. The apocalypse is the ultimate creative destruction, the complete breakdown of the familiar world. Engaging with apocalyptic themes in creative contexts may provide a safe way to process anxiety about change and loss while exploring transformative possibilities.
Examine what we can learn from apocalyptic psychology about human nature more broadly. Apocalyptic thinking reveals our deep need for narrative coherence. We're story-making creatures who can't tolerate chaos and meaninglessness. We'll create meaning even if we have to imagine the end of the world to do it. It reveals our need for justice. The popularity of apocalyptic narratives across cultures suggests a nearly universal human conviction that injustice cannot be the final word, that somehow, somewhere, accounts must be balanced. It reveals our capacity for tremendous hope and devastating fear, often simultaneously. The same narrative that terrifies with images of destruction comforts with promises of renewal. And it reveals our profound social nature. Apocalyptic beliefs are rarely held in isolation. They create communities, movements, and shared identities because humans need to make sense of existence together.
As we approach the end of our time together, let's talk about practical applications. How can understanding apocalyptic psychology help you in your daily life? First, it can help you recognize apocalyptic patterns in your own thinking. When you catch yourself thinking that everything is falling apart, that catastrophe is imminent, that we're approaching a point of no return, pause and examine those thoughts. Are they based on evidence, or are they apocalyptic templates your brain is imposing on ambiguous reality? Second, it can help you understand family members, friends, or communities caught up in apocalyptic beliefs. Rather than dismissing them as irrational, you can recognize the deep psychological needs these beliefs fulfill and approach conversations with more empathy and effectiveness. Third, it can help you navigate media consumption more wisely. Recognizing when content is exploiting apocalyptic psychology for clicks, views, or political manipulation allows you to consume information more critically. Fourth, it can help you build resilience against manipulation. Understanding how apocalyptic narratives work, how they create urgency and bypass rational thought, makes you less vulnerable to bad actors who weaponize these patterns. And fifth, it can help you find healthier ways to meet the legitimate needs that apocalyptic thinking addresses. You can find meaning without requiring cosmic drama. You can pursue justice without expecting supernatural intervention. You can face uncertainty without believing the end is near.
Apocalyptic thinking is a deeply human pattern that's not going away. It's been with us for thousands of years and will be with us for thousands more. The content changes, the specific predictions change, but the underlying psychological structure persists because it addresses fundamental human needs and fears. The question isn't whether we'll encounter apocalyptic narratives, it's how we'll engage with them.
We can engage with awareness, recognizing the patterns and choosing our responses consciously rather than reacting automatically. We can engage with compassion, understanding that people drawn to apocalyptic beliefs are usually trying to meet legitimate needs for meaning, justice, and control in an uncertain world. We can engage with wisdom, taking seriously the real challenges humanity faces: climate change, technological disruption, political instability, without collapsing into apocalyptic fatalism that paralyzes effective action. The apocalypse, in all its forms, tells us something important about ourselves. It reveals our deepest fears and our highest hopes. It shows us what we value enough to fight for and what we're willing to let burn away. It demonstrates our capacity for both delusional thinking and profound insight. Understanding apocalyptic psychology isn't about dismissing these narratives as mere superstition or embracing them as literal truth. It's about recognizing them as mirrors, reflecting fundamental aspects of human consciousness, and using that recognition to live more consciously, compassionately, and effectively in a world that is genuinely uncertain, but not necessarily ending.
The real work isn't preparing for the apocalypse. It's learning to live with uncertainty, to find meaning without requiring cosmic drama, to pursue justice without expecting divine intervention, and to face the genuine challenges before us with clear eyes, steady hearts, and practical wisdom. That's the insight that might actually change your life. Not preparing for an ending that keeps not coming, but learning to fully inhabit the uncertain middle where we actually live. Thank you for spending this time exploring these ideas